everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from the state of Illinois when a young teenage girl just mysteriously disappeared one winter's evening in the mid-1970s. The search for her wouldn't be a long one, as shortly after she vanished, her body was found out in the snow, and it was determined that she'd been the victim of foul play. Despite a murder investigation being launched, decades would pass with little to no movement in the case, or at least that was until a new DNA technique gave the detectives a huge clue as to what the killer may have looked like, a key physical characteristic that they may have had, and when the perpetrator was finally identified, with that came the realization that their victim count didn't stop at one. This twisted individual was a likely serial killer. A serial killer who, would you believe it, actually accidentally caused his own death whilst he was in the act of trying to murder someone else. But just quickly before we get into the case, I would like to say a big thank you to Aura for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. Now, Aura is actually only available to people in the US, but fun fact, according to my YouTube analytics page, the majority of my audience are US based. So I still really wanted to share this company with you guys because I think that the service they provide is super important. Aura helps to keep you and your private information safe online by basically alerting you to which data brokers have gained access to and are selling your information, like your email address, your home address, your passwords, health records, and even more to scammers, which is of course a really terrifying thought, but luckily Aura can help you with this. As well as showing you which data brokers have obtained your private information, they will also go to these data brokers themselves and submit opt-out requests on your behalf so that your information can be removed from their databases, protecting you from potential hackers, and it also massively reduces the amount of spam you receive, like spam phone calls or spam emails. I want to bring to your attention this article from earlier this year in which AT&T revealed that data from 73 million customers was leaked on the dark web, and they encouraged their customers to do things like use stronger passwords, monitor account activity, and consider credit freezes or fraud alerts, which all sounds a bit overwhelming, doesn't it? But luckily, Aura once again has got your back with that. They have all of these tools and more with just one plan at a fraction of the cost. They do all the hard work behind the scenes to keep your privacy protected online and your data secure. So if you would like to try Aura for yourself, and I highly recommend that you do, then you can go to www.aura.com/Mollie Westbrook to start your 2-week free trial. And the link to Aura will also be at the top line of the description box. Thank you so much once again to Aura for partnering with me. I really could not continue making these videos without the support from sponsors like Aura, so thank you again. And of course, thank you to you guys watching for always showing your support to the companies that we work with on this channel. And now, without further ado, let's just get into the case. But just before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video contains heavy themes such as rape and sexual assault. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back more than 48 years now to early 1976 in Lyle, which is a village located in DuPage County in the state of Illinois in the US. And this is Pamela Mau. She was a 16-year-old girl who lived in DuPage County with her family. Pamela, who mainly went by Pam, was born on the 24th of October 1959 to her parents Louis and Elizabeth Mau, and she was one of 4 children. She had 2 brothers named Charles and Patrick and a sister named Susan. And from what I can gather, Pam had a pretty normal, happy childhood for the time. Her brother Charles recalled how growing up the family always got on very well, and he remembered good times with Pam where they would go out camping and canoeing, just fun family activities like that. Pam was described by her loved ones as being quite a shy and quiet young girl. Her father Louis said that she was very much an introvert type. She kind of just kept to herself for the most part. She was one of those kind of people that would come across as being quite timid and shy at first, but once you got to know her and once she became comfortable around you, then she really opened up and she would be very chatty and talkative talkative and cracking jokes. She was also described as being very down to earth and friendly, and as a child she was always very well behaved. Her dad Louis said that she never really had a rebellious phase or anything. She was always just a good kid. By the time this case occurred, Pam was a student. She was a junior at the Downers Grove South High School in Illinois, and she was a typical teenage girl really. She would enjoy doing all the things that other teenage girls did, going out and spending time with friends, having fun, which happens to be exactly what she was doing on the day that this case took place. It was the 12th of January 1976. It was a Monday, and that Monday evening Pam and a couple of friends of hers were just hanging out at one of their houses in Lyle in DuPage County, and this was a regular occurrence. This was something that they did pretty much every evening. Pam and her friendship group would always get together at someone's house and they would just hang out. They would watch TV and chat and catch up, and yeah, as I said, that's exactly what they were doing on the evening of the 12th. So it was a normal evening. Pam was having a good time, having a laugh, and then around 9:45, Pam told her friends that she was going to head out to buy a soda. She said that she was either going to go to the local McDonald's or she was going to go to this laundromat. I think a laundromat is like a laundrette, right? We call them laundrettes here in the UK. They are like places where you can go and do your laundry, so I'm assuming that maybe there was a vending machine in this laundromat or a little store or something. But yeah, Pam said that she was going to go and buy a soda at either the laundromat or the McDonald's, which were both located very close to her friend's house. They were basically just across the road. It would have taken Pam only about 15 minutes or so to get there and back. So at 9:45 p.m. she left her friend's house alone and began her walk to get her soda. However, Pam Mau never returned. She never came back to her friend's house, which, to be honest, her friends didn't really think much of at first. You know, they didn't think that anything had happened to Pam. They actually assumed that she had just decided to head back to her house because she left at 9:45 and her curfew was around like 10 p.m. I believe, so they just thought, oh okay, she's gone home and not told us. Remember, this was a time before mobile phones. It wasn't like Pam could just text her friends to let them know that that was her plan, although in actual fact it seemed as though that wasn't her plan, because it got to 10 and her parents Louis and Elizabeth realised that Pam wasn't back yet, which immediately raised concerns for them because, I mean, as I said, Pam was not a rebellious child at all. If her mum and dad told her to be home for 10, she would be home for 10. She would be sure that she was, so the fact that there was no sign of her, it was strange because it was so unlike her. Her parents waited for a short while, waited for Pam to just walk through the front door with some kind of explanation as to why she was late, but that explanation never came. Pam never arrived back. And so at around 10:45 p.m, Pam's mother Elizabeth called Pam's friend's phone, their landline, the friend whose house she was at that evening, and she asked her friends if her daughter was there, could she speak to her? However, her friends obviously said, well no, she's not here, we thought that she was with you, we thought she'd gone back home. So of course at this point alarm bells really started to ring. If Pam wasn't with her friends and she wasn't back home, then where the hell was she at this time of night? So immediately Pam's parents and her friends began a search for her. They started driving along the streets looking for Pam. They went to the local McDonald's and the laundromat to see if for some reason she was still there getting her soda. Of course she wasn't. In fact, by this time the McDonald's and the laundromat had closed for the night anyway. They continued searching for Pam for about an hour or so. However, there was no sign of her anywhere. And so shortly before midnight on the 12th of January 1976, Pam's mother Elizabeth picked up the phone again, but this time to call the Lyle Police Department and report her daughter is missing. Now, despite the fact that Pam was only 16 years old, she was still technically a child, apparently the police didn't really take this report very seriously at first. You know, Pam was a teenage girl. Teenagers can often be a bit cheeky and disobedient and stay out past their curfew, so they didn't think that it was anything more than that. They didn't assume that anything sinister had happened to Pam, and they told her parents to just wait at home and she'd be back soon enough. I mean, according to a documentary that I watched about this case, they did still send out a couple of police officers that night just to have a quick look around the area for any sign of Pam, but just like her family and friends, they had no luck. They never found her. And as you can imagine, her family was so restless. With every hour that that ticked by with no news. They were just growing more and more concerned. And Pam's father, Louis, said that they did not sleep at all that night because they were so worried about her. And I can imagine that this was only made worse by the weather conditions at the time in DuPage County. It was January, it was winter time, and there had been a lot of snowfall. So it was absolutely freezing outside. So their minds must have just been going crazy, thinking, was Pam out in the dark and in the cold alone? Was she hurt or injured somewhere? They were desperate for answers, and it wouldn't be much longer before there was a huge development in the case, before there was some news, although tragically this was the kind of news that Pam's family never wanted to hear. Just the day following her disappearance, a dead body was found. On the morning of the 13th of January 1976, a member of the public, who I think just happened to work on the roads and on the highways, was driving towards his place of work when he spotted what looked like a woman's purse just lying in the middle of the road. The purse was located on College Road in DuPage County, which is just a couple of miles away from the village of Lyle. Anyway, this man spotted this woman's purse, and so he decided to pull his car over and take a closer look. However, as he did so, as he was walking towards this purse, he happened to look to the side of him, and on the side of the road over the guardrail, he noticed the body of a young woman lying on the ground, and he called the police. And it didn't take long for the police to identify this young woman. Assuming that the purse nearby belonged to her, they took a look inside and found an ID. And of course, the name on this ID was Pamela Mau. It was Pam who was lying dead on the side of the road. Pam's body was lying face down in the snow. She was fully clothed, apart from one of her shoes was off of her feet. And when police arrived at the scene, they immediately observed that her body was basically frozen, which indicated that she'd been laying there dead for a number of hours, probably all night. And initially, the police actually thought that Pam's death was the result of some kind of tragic accident. They thought that she'd been hit by a car, that this was some kind of hit and run. And so for this reason, it would appear as though they didn't really properly secure the scene. They allowed people to just walk around in the snow near the body, disturbing possible footprints or potential evidence. Of course, this wasn't a tragic accident. It was later concluded during her autopsy that Pam had in fact been the victim of foul play. But yeah, they didn't realise this at first, and so they didn't properly close off and preserve the crime scene. Speaking of Pam's autopsy, it was established that her cause of death was strangulation, and the detectives actually believed that she had been strangled with this like rubber hose that was found near her body in the snow. The marks and the bruising to her neck suggested that this was what had been used to choke her, and it was determined that it was this like gas line rubber hose that could be purchased from hardware stores and some gas stations. And unfortunately for the police, this was actually a very popular style of hose at the time. Many had been sold, so it didn't seem likely that they were going to be able to track down the person that had bought this exact one, the one that had been used to kill Pam. But back to the findings in Pam's autopsy. In addition to being strangled, the coroner also established that her time of death was somewhere between 10 p.m. and 12 a.m. on the night that she disappeared. So very shortly after she actually went missing. As we know, she left her friend's house at 9:45 p.m. to go and get a soda. So clearly she was abducted and attacked not long at all after she left, as she was walking alone. And the reason for this horrific crime, well, it was clearly sexually motivated, as the coroner also concluded that Pam had been the victim of a sexual assault. She'd been raped by her killer. She was raped, strangled, and then her body was just dumped on the side of the road in the snow like she was trash. It's awful. So the investigation into the murder of 16-year-old Pam Mau was launched, and I think right off the bat, the police probably knew that this case would be a difficult one to solve for a couple of reasons. Number one, I mean, I've already said it, but without realising, they'd already disturbed and contaminated, I suppose, the crime scene. Due to the fact that they initially thought that Pam had been hit by a car and that this was an accidental death, they didn't close it off. So evidence which may have been present would have probably been destroyed because of that. And number two, this was 1976. This was a time before DNA and forensic science science was really a thing. So it wasn't like they had that at their disposal to identify the perpetrator. But the investigation commenced nonetheless, and the police began looking into the people in Pam's life, the men, as potential suspects. And obviously, one of the first people that they looked at was Pam's boyfriend. She did have a boyfriend at the time that this case occurred. Her boyfriend was asked to come down to the police station for an interview. They asked him if he was involved in what had happened to Pam, and he said no, he had no part in her death. And so they asked him where he was on the night in question, and he said that he was just at his home with his mother. His mother had actually grounded him at the time, so he wasn't even allowed to leave the house, which his mother confirmed. However, understandably, this wasn't necessarily a very strong alibi for the detectives. They couldn't rule him out based on this alibi alone because, you know, who's to say that his mother didn't lie for him, lie about him being home all night in order to protect her son. And the police were also a little skeptical of the boyfriend because very quickly into his interview, he asked for a lawyer, which of course is his right. He has every right to stop the interview and ask for a lawyer to be present. But for the detectives, it did come across as a bit suspicious that he wasn't really willing to cooperate and answer any more questions. Could that mean that he has a guilty conscience and was worried about saying something incriminating? But eventually in the investigation, the boyfriend was more or less eliminated as a suspect. I mean, he wasn't like fully ruled out, but I think the police realized that it actually wouldn't have been very possible for him to have carried out this crime because he didn't have a car or have access to a car. And obviously Pam disappeared while she was walking to get a soda a good few miles away from where her body was found on the side of College Road. So the police felt certain that her killer must have been driving that night. Pam was probably kidnapped and forced into a vehicle, and then her body was driven to that area on College Road where she was left in the snow. The police continued looking into the people in Pam's life, and every single person was pretty much ruled out one by one. They also began looking into local criminals and were able to rule them out too. In addition to that, they were also following up on tips and leads that were being reported to them by members of the public, because news of Pam's case did spread pretty rapidly, so the police were receiving quite a significant amount of tips, I think. But there was one in particular that seemed to stand out to them. A member of the public contacted the police notifying them that they should probably look into a 19-year-old man named Michael Basso as a person of interest in Pam Mau's case. The reason being because he was overheard in a bar when he was drunk telling someone that he was the murderer. He was the man who killed Pam Mau. But as well as that, something which just added to the suspicion for the detectives was the fact that Michael Basso was actually already known to the police. He had a pretty lengthy criminal history, apparently. I don't know what for. I don't know what crimes he had committed previously, just that he had a criminal record of some kind. But additionally, the police also discovered that Michael Basso worked in a gas station in Lyle, which was literally a stone's throw away from the laundromat that Pam told her friend she was headed to buy her soda on the night that she disappeared and was murdered. And in fact, the gas station that he worked in just happened to be one that sold the exact type of rubber gas line hose that was used to strangle Pam to death. So evidence against Michael Basso really seemed to be mounting here. This was a man with a criminal record who was very familiar with the area, who worked in a gas station close to where Pam vanished from, who had easy access to the type of weapon that was used to murder Pam, and who had allegedly confessed to Pam's murder whilst he was drunk in a bar. This all seemed pretty damning. However, having said that, when you think about it, all of this evidence against Michael Basso was really nothing more than circumstantial, to be honest. They didn't have any concrete evidence directly tying him to the murder. He was brought down to the police station and questioned by detectives who presented him with this circumstantial evidence, such as his alleged confession in the bar. They asked him about that, but he said that he didn't remember ever doing that. He said that he didn't recall telling someone that he'd killed Pam, and he said that he didn't kill Pam. He was not responsible. He said that he'd never even seen Pam Mau before in his life. Michael Basso agreed to undergo a polygraph test, a lie detector test, which I feel like the police used used a hell of a lot back then during their investigations, didn't they? I don't think they're used as much nowadays because we know that they just aren't really that accurate at all in detecting lies. But anyway, Michael Basso sat down and he did this polygraph test, and the results were deemed inconclusive. So he didn't fail the test, but he also didn't pass it either. So the police didn't really have anything solid against Michael Basso. Again, everything that they had was just circumstantial, meaning that they couldn't do anything. Despite how suspicious they were, they couldn't arrest him, and he had to be released after his interview, even though he hadn't really been eliminated as a suspect. And unfortunately, it was following all of this when the case started to just go cold. The tips and leads were just resulting in dead ends, and naturally, of course, over time, the amount of tips that were being reported just became less and less. And so the police were forced to kind of wind down their investigation into Pam Mau's murder, which must have just been devastating for her family, knowing that the man who killed Pam was still out there, still free to live his life, despite taking Pam's life away from her in an incredibly brutal and vicious way. The case just remained unsolved, and it stayed that way for a very long time, for years and years, decades even. There was nothing, no developments in the Pam Mau case. But then came 2001. 2001 was the year of the 25th anniversary of Pam's death. It had been a quarter of a century since her murder, and that was when the case was revisited by the DuPage County Police Department, because obviously over those 25 years there had been huge advancements in forensic technology, and the police were hopeful that they might be able to use new DNA techniques that they didn't have back when Pam was killed in 1976 to finally identify her murderer. So what they did was they brought all of the evidence that had been collected in Pam's case out of storage, and this obviously included the clothing that she was wearing when she was found on the side of the road, and this clothing was sent off for examination. And luckily, scientists had a breakthrough and they found something. On Pam's clothing, they detected traces of the killer's semen from where Pam had been raped. So they now had the murderer's DNA profile. This was groundbreaking. They could use this to hopefully soon positively identify the perpetrator. The DNA profile was quickly entered onto the National DNA Database, onto CODIS, in search for a match, but frustratingly, there wasn't one. No matches on there. And the DNA was also compared against Michael Basso's DNA. Now, Michael Basso, by this point, by the early 2000s, he was actually dead. He'd passed away as a result of being in a car accident a number of years earlier. But despite this, the police were obviously still keen to try and somehow get his DNA profile to find out once and for all if he really was Pam Mau's killer, because he kind of was always the top suspect for the police, as they could never definitively rule him out. For years and years, there was just this cloud of suspicion hanging over Michael Basso, and he died with many people still thinking that he was a sadistic murderer, a child murderer. However, as it would turn out, he wasn't. Even though he was already deceased, the detectives were able to obtain a sample of Michael Basso's DNA from the lab that I think performed his autopsy, and when his DNA was compared against the DNA of Pam's killer, it wasn't a match. He was not the perpetrator. So if Michael Basso wasn't, then who was? Well, it seemed as though that question would once again remain unanswered, because no match to the killer's DNA was ever found, resulting in the case once again going cold. Again, years and years passed with little to no movement in the investigation. In fact, Pam's case even became known as the unsolvable case amongst law enforcement because of how long it had been with no answers as to who killed Pam. But that title of the unsolvable case wasn't enough to put one detective off of having a go at cracking it and finally catching the killer. Chris Loudon was a detective with the Lyle Police Department, and he described how he always kind of felt this personal connection to Pam Mau's murder because he was the same age as Pam when she died. I think I read in one article that he was born literally only about 2 weeks after Pam, and her case always stayed with him. It broke his heart, really, because he would always think about, you know, the things that he got to do in his life, the experiences that he got to have, and how Pam never got that, how those opportunities were taken away away from her, how her future was taken away because she was killed at just 16 years old. I have a quote here from Detective Chris Loudon. He said, "I kept thinking about all the wonderful things and sad things that have gone on in my life. I've gone to prom, I fell in love, got my heart broken, got married, had kids, gone on vacations, done all these wonderful things that Pam never got a chance to do, and quite frankly, it pissed me off." And this anger that Detective Chris Loudon felt is what led to him wanting to become involved in trying to help solve the Pam Mau case once and for all. Alongside some other detectives, he became involved with the case in March of 2019, by which point it had been more than 43 years since Pam's death. And it was in 2019 when the new team of detectives decided to turn to a DNA technique called DNA phenotyping, which we've spoken about a couple of times on this channel. I actually love talking about DNA phenotyping because I find the whole concept so interesting. So just to refresh your memory, DNA phenotyping is a process where scientists will take a DNA profile and using it, they are able to predict what the owner of that DNA looks like, and this is based on their genetic information and DNA sequence. DNA phenotyping can tell you things such as the owner's possible eye colour, their skin tone, possible hair colour, their origin, etc. And using this information, they can create composite images of the person, of what they may have looked like. And so Detective Loudon and the rest of the team thought, well, what have we got to lose? Why don't we give that a go in Pam's case? They got in touch with Parabon Nanolabs, who specialise in DNA phenotyping, and with their help, this snapshot of Pam's killer was created. This is what they believe he may have looked like around the age of 25. Obviously, he would have been much older by this point in time. But there was one thing that particularly stood out to the scientists who conducted these DNA phenotyping tests on the killer's DNA. They were able to tell the detectives that the man responsible for Pam's death more than likely had green-coloured eyes. In fact, they were about 93% certain that he had green eyes, so, you know, that's quite a high percentage. And this information was really promising for the police, actually, because did you know that only about 2% of the population have green eyes? I'm not gonna lie, I love that fact. It always makes me feel really special as someone who also has green eyes. I always think they look a little bit brown on camera, but I promise they are like a dark green, I swear. Anyway, yes, the lab were able to tell the detectives that the killer most likely had green eyes, which was great because, I mean, just this fact alone was going to make it even easier for the police to narrow down the suspect pool, because they know that they are specifically looking for someone with green eyes, which are very rare. But the breakthroughs in the case didn't end there. You see, as well as using DNA phenotyping to generate the snapshot of the killer, Parabon Nanolabs also decided to use the killer's DNA profile to try and locate potential relatives of the perpetrator using genetic genealogy. They uploaded the killer's profile onto GEDmatch, a website where users can do just that. They can upload their DNA on there to find relatives and build their family tree. And so Parabon started building the murderer's family tree, and they were able to identify several distant cousins of the perpetrator, which led them to a name, a surname. Parabon were able to tell the detectives that Pam Mau's killer most likely had the surname Lindel. So the police immediately did some digging. They were looking into men who lived in the area of DuPage County at the time of Pam's murder and who had the last name Lindel. And they narrowed down their search to two brothers with that name, one of which, would you believe it, had green eyes. This brother was called Bruce Lindel. He was the younger brother of the two. And when the police took a look at an old picture of Bruce Lindel from around the time of Pam's murder, they realised that he actually looked a hell of a lot like the snapshot that Parabon had created using DNA phenotyping. But who was Bruce Lindel? Well, he was born on the 29th of January 1953 in the city of St. Charles in DuPage and Kane counties in Illinois. His parents were called Jerome and Arlene Lindel, and to be honest, there isn't really a huge amount of information online that I could find about Bruce Lindel's childhood and his upbringing. I know that he attended the Downers Grove South High School, so the same high school that Pam attended, and Bruce would have been about 23 years old at the time that Pam was murdered, by the way, in 1976, so he was about 7 years older than her. But yeah, he went went to the Downers Grove South High School, and the people who knew Bruce in school, his classmates, just described him as being very, very strange, to be honest. He had a reputation in school as being someone who gave girls the creeps. He was just a very creepy guy, and a very aggressive guy too. I came across one article which talked about a woman named Terry Cooper who went to school with Bruce Lindel, and she recalled how one night, I think when they were in high school, she and Bruce Lindel were at this bowling alley, and after they left, Bruce was very, very insistent on giving Terry a ride home in his car, but she had her own car at the bowling alley, and so she said, no thanks, I don't need a ride. However, when she went to start her car, the engine wouldn't run, it wouldn't start, and Lindel was just there watching, again trying to persuade her to just get into his vehicle. But eventually Terry's car did start, and when it did, she remembered Bruce Lindel getting really angry, and he started swearing, and he said that thing shouldn't have started. And it was because of this that Terry just had a feeling that Bruce had done something to mess with Terry's vehicle. He messed with the wires or the engine or something in the hopes that it wouldn't start, and so she would be forced to accept a lift from him. But why? Why was he so desperate for Terry to get into his car? What was he planning to do with her? In addition to that, Terry recalled how a couple of years after this, her brother got into an altercation with a then 20-year-old Bruce Lindel because her brother witnessed Bruce Lindel trying to force another young girl into his car. This young girl was trying to resist and she was shouting for help, and so Terry's brother stepped in and she got this young girl away from Bruce. And Bruce was so angry at this that he became violent towards Terry's brother, and he started beating him, and her brother was beaten so badly that he needed 11 stitches in his face. So yeah, a very, very aggressive young man was Bruce Lindel. He was clearly someone who couldn't take no for an answer. When girls rejected him, he would just fly off of the handle. After leaving high school, Bruce Lindel went off to college and eventually earned a degree in electromechanics. He became an electrician. But despite this, he went on to build up a pretty extensive criminal history. As he entered his 20s, he was arrested a number of times for relatively minor crimes, apparently. At one point, he was arrested for possession of marijuana, although he only ever received small fines for these offences. However, as I literally just mentioned, Bruce Lindel was a very aggressive man who could not take no for an answer. And over the years, he is believed to have attacked and raped several women. On one occasion, in March of 1979, so this is just a couple of years after Pam Mau was killed, he lured a 20-year-old woman named Annette Lazar into his home by agreeing to sell some marijuana to her. However, she would soon discover that that wasn't his intention at all, and once she was inside of his home, Bruce Lindel raped her at gunpoint. Annette did escape and she contacted the police. However, according to reports, no charges were brought forward because Annette was apparently a drug addict, and so the police just didn't believe her. They didn't believe that she was credible. But also, Bruce Lindel was good friends with one of the police officers who were, I think, involved in this case. In fact, sources state that Bruce was renting the house that he lived in off of this police officer at the time. And so because they were friends, they believed Bruce Lindel over Annette, and he was not arrested or charged, which is disgusting, but alas, that is what happened. On another occasion, Lindel was apparently pulled over by the police, and they discovered that alongside him in his car there was this woman who was unconscious and bleeding from her head. And so the police asked Lindel what he was doing with her, and he claimed that he was taking her to the hospital, even though he wasn't actually driving in the direction of the hospital. Emergency services were called to the scene, and the woman was instead taken to the hospital by an ambulance, and hospital staff found that this poor woman had been the victim of a horrific sexual assault. And despite this woman telling them that she couldn't remember anything after Bruce Lindel gave her this drink at a party, once again, no charges were brought against him, which is insane. I mean, it's obvious that this woman was clearly drugged and raped by Bruce Lindel, and yet nothing was done. And there were more women that shared very similar experiences with Bruce Lindel. However, there was one case in particular that really stood out to the homicide detectives. The detectives who became involved with the unsolved Pam Mau case in 2019. Upon identifying Bruce Lindel as a possible suspect following the DNA phenotyping and genetic genealogy processes and looking further into him, they discovered that he was a suspect in the abduction, rape and murder of another woman. Just 4 years after Pam Mau's death, in June of 1980, 25-year-old Deborah Colliander was in the parking lot of a shopping mall in Aurora in Illinois, which is, I think, where Bruce Lindel was living at the time. Pam was in this parking lot. She was locking up her bicycle to a bike rack, and as she was doing so, she was approached by a man, a stranger. This stranger was, of course, Bruce Lindel. Bruce told Deborah that he was having some trouble with starting up his car, so he asked her if she could help him. He asked Deborah to sit in the driver's seat and turn on the ignition whilst he fiddled with the engine under the car bonnet, and Deborah agreed. She agreed to help out this stranger, and she went with Lindel to his car. However, as she was sitting in the driver's seat, Bruce Lindel opened the door and he immediately started threatening Deborah. He forced her into the passenger seat, locked the car doors and drove away. He kidnapped Deborah from the parking lot. He drove a terrified Deborah to his home. He actually took off the belt that he was wearing and he looped it around Deborah's neck like it was some kind of dog collar. And using this, he pulled Deborah into his house where he raped her and held her hostage. By some miracle, Deborah was able to get out of that house and escape whilst Lindel was sleeping. And she immediately went to the police to report her ordeal, and Bruce Lindel was arrested. And this time, he was charged. He was charged with the kidnap and rape of Deborah Colliander. However, he was released on bail because he had the money to be able to pay for his bail. But he was still going to go to trial for this. His trial was due to take place just the year following in 1981. But as it would turn out, the trial would never actually go ahead, because in a shocking turn of events in October of 1980, so just 4 months after Deborah's assault, Deborah Colliander just suddenly mysteriously disappeared after leaving her place of work. And no one knew why. No one had any idea what had happened to her. And because she was missing, that meant that the trial against Bruce Lindel for the rape of Deborah Colliander just couldn't proceed. Because of course Deborah was the key witness. Without her present to testify against Lindel, the prosecution just didn't really have a case. And so the charges against Bruce Lindel had to be dropped, and he was a free man once again. This dangerous sexual predator was free to roam the streets. The mystery of Deborah Colliander's disappearance remained unsolved for a long time, until 2 years after she went missing in 1982, when finally her dead body was found. She was found by a farmer in a shallow grave in a field in Oswego Township in Illinois. As I understand it, a cause of death could not be established due to the fact that Deborah's body was pretty decomposed by the time she was found. However, of course, given the circumstances, the fact that she was found in a shallow grave, the police knew that foul play was involved. Deborah had been murdered, and it doesn't take a genius to work out the man responsible for this crime was probably Bruce Lindel. Deborah vanished and was clearly killed shortly before Bruce Lindel was due to go to trial for her abduction and rape. So the police theorized that he carried out her murder so that she wouldn't be able to testify against him, or perhaps he didn't commit the crime himself. Maybe he hired a hitman. I did read on one source that not long after Deborah's body was discovered, a man did come forward to the Aurora police claiming that Bruce Lindel had offered him a large sum of money to kill Deborah Colliander and get rid of her body. So whether he physically carried out the murder or not, I mean, he clearly was the one responsible for Deborah's death, but would you believe it, once again, no charges were brought against him for Deborah's murder. But this time, it wasn't because of police incompetence or corruption. The reason Bruce Lindel could never be charged with Deborah Colliander's murder was because by the time her body was found in 1982, he was dead. Bruce Lindel passed away in April of 1981 at the age of 28, and the circumstances surrounding his death were actually incredibly ironic. He accidentally killed himself whilst he was literally in the process of trying to kill someone else. It was the 4th of April 1981, and that day Bruce Lindel was just driving around in his car in the city of Naperville in Illinois, and it was whilst he was cruising around this shopping district when he met this 18-year-old boy named Charles Robert Huber Jr., who mainly went by Chuck. Lindel and Chuck got chatting, and eventually they agreed to go and play some 10-pin bowling together. And then following this, Bruce Lindel persuaded Chuck to come back to his girlfriend's house with him where they could have some drinks, and Chuck said, yeah, okay. However, when they arrived back, Bruce Lindel grabbed a knife and he attacked Chuck Huber and just began stabbing him repeatedly. He stabbed Chuck a total of 28 times with this knife, and tragically, Chuck died as a result of his horrific injuries. And it's not even known what the hell the motive was for this attack. It didn't seem like there was a sexual motive here, so it's completely unknown why Bruce decided to kill Chuck. But my god, did Chuck put up a fight. There was a violent struggle between him and Bruce Lindel, and it was during this struggle when Lindel accidentally cut himself with the knife. The knife slipped and Lindel accidentally stabbed himself in the thigh, and this stab wound was so deep that it severed his femoral artery, which is the main artery in the thigh and leg, and Bruce Lindel died there and then alongside his victim, Chuck Huber Jr. He bled to death at the scene. Like I said, he accidentally killed himself whilst in the act of killing someone else, which is crazy. So I can imagine that this was really disappointing for the detectives in Pam Mau's case to learn in 2019 when they realised that their now top suspect in Pam's murder was in fact dead and had been dead for, God, like 38 years now. Of course, that meant that if he was Pam's killer, he was never going to face justice for her brutal death. But regardless, the detectives still wanted to find out once and for all whether or not he was the perpetrator, and so in order to do that, they needed his DNA. But of course, he was dead, so how were they going to get it? Well, they decided to apply for a court order to exhume Bruce Lindel's remains in the hopes that they would be able to get a sample of his DNA from his remains in order to test against the DNA of Pam Mau's killer. And thankfully, this court order was granted, and that same year, 2019, his body was exhumed. His coffin was dug up and the DNA sample was taken, and when his DNA was sent off for comparison in January of 2020, it was found to be a match. An exact match to the DNA of the man who killed 16-year-old Pam Mau. Finally, after nearly 4.5 decades, the detectives had solved the mystery of who had murdered Pam Mau all those years ago. It was Bruce Lindel. In fact, it was determined that there was only a 1 in 1.83 quadrillion chance of the DNA, the semen on Pam's clothing, belonging to anyone other than Bruce Lindel. And there are only 7.9 billion people on the planet, so finally, after 44 years, the detectives could give Pam's family the news that they had been waiting for so long. They could tell them the name of Pam's killer, which must have been so bittersweet for them. Like, yeah, it's amazing that they finally have those answers, but to also learn that Pam's killer was now deceased himself and could therefore never go to prison or face punishment for her death. It must have been awful for her family. And obviously, because Bruce is dead, no one knows exactly what happened that fateful night back in January of 1976, because the only two people who can tell us, Pam and Bruce, are not alive. But the detectives' theory as to what happened is that Bruce Lindel was parked in a gas station in Lyle, Illinois on the evening of Pam's disappearance when he spotted Pam walking to get herself a soda, and in that moment, as soon as he saw her, he decided to kidnap her. How he managed to get Pam into his vehicle is unknown, whether he either threatened her with a weapon and forced her in, or whether he perhaps used the same technique that he used a couple of years later on Deborah Colliander. He tricked Pam and claimed that he needed her to help him start his car and drove away with her trapped inside. Whatever the circumstances, once she was inside, he raped Pam and strangled her to death with that rubber gas line hose. And then he just dumped her body on the side of the road in the snow where she was found the next morning. An absolutely abhorrent crime. Bruce Lindel was clearly a sick and twisted and evil individual. And actually, if you think about it, a suspected serial killer. We know that he killed Pam Mau. We know that he killed Chuck Huber Jr. It's pretty much confirmed that he killed Deborah Colliander, or had her killed, so that she couldn't testify against him during the rape trial. So that's 3 victims right there, and it's also strongly believed that Bruce Lindel was responsible for the murder of another young woman as well, a woman named Deborah McCall. Deborah McCall was a 16-year-old girl and also a student at the Downers Grove North High School. And on the 5th of November 1979, so only 3 years after Pam Mau was killed, Deborah McCall left her school to begin her journey home, and she was never seen alive again. She just completely disappeared after leaving school. And to this day, she has never been found. More than 45 years later, she's never been located and her body has never been found. But many suspect that Bruce Lindel was responsible for her disappearance and murder. They believe that he murdered her just like he murdered Pam, because there seem to be a couple of similarities between the 2 cases. Both girls were 16 years old, they were both students at the Downers Grove High School, and they both vanished whilst they were walking alone. So if Bruce was responsible for her death too, that would make his victim count 4. But I mean, who knows if he stopped at 4? I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest if it was revealed someday that Bruce Lindel had a lot more victims than that. And it's just sickening that he never really faced justice for any of them, any of the crimes that he committed. He got away with pretty much everything that he did, which is a really awful note to end on. But that concludes this case. That concludes the case of Pam Mau and also Chuck Huber Jr., Deborah Colliander and Deborah McCall. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on this case in the comments. It's a really, really crazy one. I don't think I've ever come across a case where a killer has accidentally caused his own death whilst he was killing someone else. So yeah, let me know your thoughts, and of course also let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. They can be solved cases, unsolved cases, serial killer cases, you name it. Again, you can pop them in the comments below, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box too, if you would prefer to go through that. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye.